Great. Well, I think we'll get started. I'm David Mitchell, Director of Government and External Relations at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this week's conference, U.S. Representative Ro Khanna. Congressman Khanna represents California's 17th Congressional District, located in the heart of Silicon Valley, and is about to start his third term in the House of Representatives. He sits on the Budget, Armed Services, and Oversight and Reform Committees, and is first vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He also serves as an assistant whip for the Democratic Caucus. Perhaps of particular interest to this audience, earlier in his career, Representative Khanna taught economics at Stanford University, law at Santa Clara University, and American jurisprudence at San Francisco State University. So the congressman has successfully transitioned from teaching about law and economics to passing laws about economics, making him particularly well suited to address us today as we consider and have been considering all week the best ways to make academic research on inequality and growth actionable for policymakers. Representative Khanna has also been working in consultation with Equitable Growth on a proposal that would bring economic evidence to bear on the policymaking process in innovative, impactful ways. So we're very excited to hear a little bit more about that and other insights into how to make our economy stronger, more resilient, and more equitable. A few quick housekeeping items. There will be time for audience Q&A at the end, so please click the live Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions during the remarks. And this session is on the record, so we encourage you to join the conversation on social media. The congressman's Twitter handle is @RepRoKhanna, and the conference hashtags are EG2021 and EGGrantee. And now, Representative Khanna, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for all of the work that the Washington Center for Equitable Growth has done and your partnership with our office. And it's really an honor to be able to speak to such a distinguished group of academics and practitioners. Let me start out with this perplexing claim. I would argue that there has never been a larger disconnect, in some sense, between the academic world and the political world. Consider this. A Theory of Justice was published in 1971. Most people would think that John Rawls is arguably the greatest American philosopher of modern times. And his work, A Theory of Justice, is probably still the preeminent philosophical work talking about the need for distributive justice stemming from first principles, American fundamental ideas, as he would say. And yet, since 71, one would argue that our policy has gone exactly in the opposite direction of his difference principle, which was a concern for the least well-off in our nation. If anything, since 71, policies have become more focused on unregulated markets. There's been less labor union protections, less concern for those who are in need. We have seen the total focus on economic growth and GDP at the expense of issues of equity. And so you wonder, why is that? Why is it that the preeminent work on distributive justice would come out in 71, and for the next 50 years, those policies have had a hard time actually being, that framework has had a hard time being implemented in our policymaking? I think that we are finally at a turning point, probably in the last 5-6 years, maybe after the Wall Street crash, where the reality is catching up to what Rawls perhaps wrote about in the early 70s. There's now a wider recognition that you cannot just have GDP growth and the stock market as the only signals, the only metrics for what a true success and well-being look like in an economy. And what we've worked with the Center for CBL scoring that we're doing ought to consider things other than just the impact on the GDP and the impact on the deficit. I mean, you don't have to have a Rawlsian difference principle and an impact on the least well-off on every bill. But for the major bills, you should at least look at what is the impact on economic distribution. What is the impact that a bill is going to have on those who are poor, those who are working class, and what is the impact that that the bill would have on those who are wealthy? And just like there's all this conversation about what the impact would be on deficits or what the impact would be on the cost, it seems policymakers and the media should know what is the impact a bill is going to have on the question of equity and the question of inequality. And so that in a nutshell is what we've been working with the Washington Center of Growth on to make the case that the basic analysis of fairness should be part of what the CBO does. And I'm actually quite optimistic, having talked to the CBO director and others in Congress, that we can get momentum for this, even if we don't get it formally in the law, that maybe the CBO would adopt some of these important metrics. Now, this is not new. I mean, there are other places, obviously, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have done a tremendous work on the capability theory, saying that we've got to measure things other than GDP. We have to look at health. We have to look at a person's opportunities for political participation, their opportunities for having a life as a family member, their opportunities for being part of community, that there's so many factors, their health, so many factors that are essential for a good society. And the OECD has adopted some of those metrics. The UN has adopted some of those metrics. Other nations have adopted some of those metrics. So what we're asking with the CBO is actually to catch up with some of the thinking in the academy that yes, GDP is a consideration. No one would deny that you don't want that we shouldn't be measuring GDP. No one would deny that we ought not to be considering how the stock market is doing, where about 40% or 50% of Americans are invested. But we have to have other considerations as well to make well-informed policy. And so what our legislation is trying to do is bring the CBO scoring and metrics more consistent with what a lot of people have been writing about what are all the constituent parts of a well-functioning society. Then I think we have to make the argument beyond fairness. I mean, obviously, Rawls was most concerned about what is just, what is fair. And this has been a particular strong strain of thought, I would argue, in Democratic politics. Everyone from Bernie Sanders to Elizabeth Warren to so many good progressives are all about how do we have equity, how do we have fairness in our system, how do we deal with the fact that so much concentration of wealth is at the very top and so many people have been left out, not even being able to pay bills, not even being able to afford a place to live from a fairness perspective. But I think that for progressives, we also have to make the argument in terms of economic growth. The reality is, and again, here Stiglitz and Sen and others' work is very helpful. The reality is that the investment in education and investment in healthcare are two of the biggest things that a country can do to actually produce strong economic outcomes. That it is, as James Heckman's work has shown, actually supporting of human capital and human capital formation. Now, there's a difference where I would argue people like Heckman or Becker or those who focused on human capital formation are still looking at it from the lens of, well, what is good for economic growth? And others may be looking at it, philosophers, Nussbaum or Sen, may be looking at it more from, well, what is good for human development and equity? But the point is there's actually a large convergence. That turns out that what is good for equity and what is good for dignity may in many ways converge with what is good for growth. Certainly when you look at things like investing in early childhood education, when you look at things like investing in healthcare for everyone, when you look at things like investing in nutrition. So it is perplexing to me why the left has allowed the Republicans to get away with saying that increasing military budgets and cutting taxes is going to lead to 4 or 5% economic growth. It never does, but that's what they run on every time. And we don't attribute an economic growth number for our policies. But I believe that when you invest in people's education, when you invest in their nutrition, when you provide them with basic housing, when you make sure that they have basic healthcare, that you're going to create more entrepreneurs, that you're going to create more people participating in society with good jobs and paying taxes. And that is actually going to fuel economic growth and fuel greater revenue. And our side needs to be making that argument. So we need more fair measures in terms of CBO scoring. We need more analysis. And I think this is a great project for those of you there is make the case why progressive policies will lead to economic growth, why they will create and generate wealth in the long term, how they have in other countries, in certainly in parts of Asia, and how they have it in our country, how the growth of the middle class from the 50s through the post World War II era through about the 70s was one of a strong middle class and development, exclusionary on issues of race and gender, but by and large strong in how we would do that. We also need to look at the racial impact and the disparate of wealth creation. I mean, the reality is that even now, a Black family makes about 1/10 of, in terms of wealth, of what a white family makes. It's staggering that a Black person who has gotten a college degree is likely to make less wealth than a white person who didn't have a college degree. And the racial wealth gap over the last 3 decades has actually increased. I mean, think about that. And the Industrial Revolution was exclusionary. I mean, the GI Bill was exclusionary. There was still a huge discrimination. And even as formal discrimination has declined, the racial wealth gap has increased. This is a huge dilemma that needs to be looked into. What are the causes after the last 30 years of the racial wealth gap increasing? And if we don't decrease that racial wealth gap, are we really moving towards a more equal society? Or are we moving to a racially more disparate society? One of my concerns has been, and I will end on this and then open it up for questions, is that it is not enough for the dignity of a human being to simply have material resources, education and health and a $15 wage, that we have to listen to people's aspiration for wealth generation. And right now, a lot of the wealth generation in this country is concentrated in the district I represent in Silicon Valley or Boston. In a manufacturing economy, we were much more networked. When manufacturing did well, coal towns did well, railroad towns did well. It was a networked web of prosperity. The digital economy, to some extent, has severed those connections. So you could do very, very well in Silicon Valley. Of course, we can talk about the inequality in my own district and workers, and it's a whole longer conversation. But you can do well in a region and still be severed from other regions doing well. We have to provide people with the opportunity to create wealth in communities across America and have place-based policies that recognize that some places that have faced deindustrialization, that have faced the retail apocalypse, they need to have opportunities for starting businesses, for creating jobs, for working remotely in this economy, for bringing in income so that they're not just consumers of goods, but actually producers of income and entrepreneurship, and that they can create wealth in those communities. And we should have to give them the foundation to be able to do that. But democratizing access to wealth generation of the 21st century, I think, is as important as the underlying foundation of an investment in health and education for our society. So that is sort of my framework where how I approach these issues. I think the academic research on these things are so critical in linking it to economic growth and in figuring out what types of policies can work in a place-based environment, in making the case that what type of investments will have the best return, and in making the case why we need more thoughtful metrics at the CBO. I would love to open it up now to questions from the audience.
Thank you, Congressman, for those very thought-provoking comments and remarks, and they have solicited some questions already. So I will get started on dictating some of those questions to you, and then folks should still please enter any questions that have come to mind through the live Q&A box. So the first question is, in the US case, what is the relative importance of CBO metrics versus rulemaking and incorporating distributional effects into the benefit cost analysis that go through OMB or OIRA? So I guess the question kind of focused on how much can you in the legislature require of, in the rulemaking process, the kind of analysis that you're talking about with distribution?
Well, the rulemaking, obviously, in some senses, would have the force of law, but the rulemaking may be narrower in scope. So it may be that an agency has certain discretion to do certain things, and rulemaking should say take into consideration equity, and that's important. But the rulemaking isn't going to say that if you have $1 trillion tax package, who should it go to? And right now, there's no not formal analysis of who would really benefit distributionally. So the CBO is not binding. The CBO is something that is a analysis that can inform congressional decision makers and the media. So I think we need both. I mean, we need it in the rulemaking, but we definitely need it with the CBO. So the conversation doesn't always become, this is what it costs and this is the deficit implication, but there's also a formal analysis of the social equality aspect of it.
Great. Next question is, what types of research have been most effective at convincing on-the-fence colleagues, especially those worried about impacts on businesses, that progressive policies will lead to positive macroeconomic outcomes?
So I think James Hankman's work, obviously he won a Nobel Prize for it, but I think that has been very effective, where you're actually looking at a rate of return and you're measuring things and you're saying, here is the rate of return on investment in early childhood education. I think that kind of specificity and concrete analysis and field work is very helpful. I particularly liked Good Economics for Hard Times, where there was a case made that increased immigration, I think it was Abhijit Banerjee, about increased immigration actually being good for an economy because those immigrants are not displacing workers, but are spending money. And if they didn't come in, there would just be automation, and that the traditional analysis isn't looking at the amount of consumer spending. So I think those kind of cases where you have very concrete issues and you're looking at why something is going to either have a rate of return or have an economic impact that is concrete are very helpful. And that's where I think the research can be the most persuasive. I mean, I doubt maybe there is someone as thoughtful as John Rawls out there, but if Rawls's theory of justice couldn't convince the American people, I'm dubious that more arguments just for fairness will. But the arguments of economics and economic growth probably could.
So clearly the academic research has made it into your hands. You're quite fluent in it. Do you have any advice for researchers who, what tactics they can use to best get in the hands of decision makers the work that they're doing, which, oftentimes I think there is a divide between the conversations happening in academia and the conversations happening on the Hill?
I think that being succinct, so a lot of times having a one-page succinct, here is the punchline, here is the upshot. A lot of times there isn't a clear ask, and people who are in Congress are policy focused. There probably should be. We all should be a little more reflective, but what's the bottom line? What does this mean? So, I was having a good conversation with John Gruber up at MIT, an economist who helped us with a memo on, and he had a couple of key statistics that 73% of the unemployment insurance actually gets spent versus the PPP program, which only increased jobs by 2%, and 25% of the loans went to the top 1%. Those kind of nuggets, those very specific issues. And so what's the upshot? Tell the speaker that we ought to have more for unemployment insurance than we ought to have for PPP. So I think the more it is tied in to relevance, one of the things I've learned in Congress, I used to go on and I said, I don't want to go on CNN or MSNBC to talk about the president's, Trump's scandals, and I want to go on to talk about the CBO, what I'm doing, or my legislation. And then I didn't get booked for 2-3 months. And then my team said, okay, if you want to go on, you got to talk about the news of the day. So now I go and talk about the news of the day for 80%, and then 20% I get to talk about my priorities. So you have to have the research geared to meet the moment. If Congress is talking about stimulus and you're sending in a research paper on something very, very important, but not relevant, it's probably not going to get as much attention as if you said something that's relevant to the current debate.
That's very helpful. And since you brought up kind of the UI and PPP programs, can you say a few words about, I don't know, the current state of play, the stalemate that Congress is in now in responding to the coronavirus recession and the suffering that a lot of American families are facing right now?
Well, the state of play is that everyone wants something done except Mitch McConnell. I mean, that's the state of play. I mean, Mitch McConnell is literally the obstacle. You've got a bipartisan Republican group that is willing to work with the speaker and majority leader, around 900 billion. I mean, we have differences. I want a stimulus check. I want more unemployment insurance, but we're all willing to compromise. We're even willing to compromise on liability language and saying it can toll it, but it can't take away the liability. And there's the progressives are even willing to do that. But we can't do what McConnell wants, which is to not have any unemployment insurance. I mean, literally, he wants to take away unemployment insurance for the most needy, and he knows that's a non-starter. So the question is just, is he serious about doing something, or does he have the philosophy that he was so blunt about, which was he wanted to make Obama a one-term president? And is that the approach here?
Thanks for that. Another question has come in from the audience. What are some recent pieces of legislation enacted by Congress where you think more robust distributional analysis might have changed the result, changed the vote?
It's a great question. Well, I think on the defense bill every year, I mean, I think a distributional analysis there would have made a difference. Certainly the CARES Act and then the subsequent PPP programs, a distributional analysis highlighting how many people were left out in minority communities, highlighting or trying to anticipate that, anticipating which communities would really benefit, anticipating what where the money actually went. I mean, and some of it they actually, the CARES Act wasn't perfect and there are a lot of problems to it, but some of the attacks on it also are over the top, saying that all the money went to corporations and just the top few percent. That also is not accurate. There was a large amount of money that went to people who were unemployed and people who were in the working class and middle class. So in some cases, it could lead to better policy. In other cases, it could lead to more accurate perception out there so that people actually know that things aren't quite as rigged as they may be in every piece of legislation. But right now, there's no clarity. There's, if I were to get up and say, here's what I think that the CARES Act did, and someone else were to get up and say, no, it all went to the top 1%, and someone else said, no, so many communities were left behind. It's just all abstract conversation. There's no one rigorously analyzing the distributional impacts.
Right. Well, hopefully we'll get to the bottom of that with your proposal. Another question's come in. What do you think is the most pressing but underappreciated policy issue today?
I think the access to economic opportunity in a globalized and a world with a technology revolution. You're staring at a world that is changing with increased AI and automation, with increased concentration of economic activity in huge swaths of the country, minority communities or rural communities, totally left out of wealth production. I talk about Kenosha, Wisconsin, not just because of Jacob Blake shooting, but the economics there. Manufacturing left. They have an Amazon fulfillment center. 3,000 people are employed. It's a good thing that they're employed, but they're making $15 at best, and they don't like a lot of their jobs. They don't have proper benefits, and all of the people who are making a lot of money in Amazon are sitting in Seattle. So one of the reasons that Kenosha, Wisconsin, probably is not happy with things is not to do simply with the issue of police violence. It's because they don't have access to the middle class life that they once did as a manufacturing town. And we haven't figured out how do we bring good jobs, how do we bring opportunity for someone to start a business in their garage or their home in communities that have been left behind in a post-industrial economy. And what does that mean? And what does it mean as cars are becoming increasingly automated and basically machines on wheels, and the process of making cars are becoming increasingly automated? What does that mean for oil workers? What does it mean for their livelihood? What does it mean for their kids? To me, these questions are front and center.
And you mentioned tech, you mentioned Amazon. Obviously, you represent a district with a lot of headquarters of big tech companies. I'm curious, which we also heard from scholars this week around competition and antitrust rules. What is your view on the government's role in regulating that industry and those companies?
We need stronger antitrust enforcement. I completely believe that we need a duty to deal fairly so that Amazon can't discriminate against small businesses that want to sell on its platform. We need more scrutiny over mergers. I mean, WhatsApp and Instagram should never have been able to be acquired by Facebook. And obviously the recent case looking at whether to unwind them, I think makes sense. We need greater scrutiny on future mergers. We need a greater sense that people should be able to abuse their platform to keep out competitors. But all of those things, and I'm as strong as you can tell on antitrust law, is not going to create good paying jobs in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I mean, it's sort of, people hang their hat on antitrust, and it's tempting. It'll create more innovation. It'll probably create more Googles in my district. But the tougher question is, what are you doing for people in Jim Clyburn's district in graduating from an HBCU? What are you doing in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Jefferson, Iowa? How are you getting those folks part of a new economy with economic prospects like they did in the manufacturing economy? And I think we don't get deep enough on those questions. And so antitrust is just one arrow in a quiver, but it is not a silver bullet.
And on the labor issues, I'm curious, maybe you can do some translating or some political analysis for us. In the blue state of California, we had the recent proposition around app-based drivers being classified as independent contractors or employees.
Right.
I think it's fair to say that the somewhat more conservative viewpoint won the day in that election, as well as on property taxes and other things in California. Do you have a sense of kind of why those votes have gone in that direction?
Yeah, I would say it's not a conservative viewpoint. It's a nonsensical viewpoint. I mean, Uber literally argued. I mean, you should go read the briefs. They argued in court when they were trying to overturn this proposition that when you sit in your Uber, that the employee is not the driver, that the person who's taking you for your Uber ride, that the employee is really the techie who's building the software, and that the driver is not essential to Uber services. A sixth grader would refute that argument, as the judge did. I mean, it was absurd, patently, to think that the Uber driver was not essential to the business of Uber. But there's no complex analysis needed. They spent $200 million, and that's how they won. It's not like they won the argument through reason or dialogue or convincing a jury or judges or legislators. They literally just spent their way to victory. And it is a terrible decision long term for tech, because if I were leading one of these tech companies, I would say my biggest risk is not how I'm going to continue to make sure that I'm leading the S&P 500. 90% of the wealth of the S&P 500 over the last 5 years is the FANG plus Microsoft stocks. My biggest concern would be, how do I make sure everyone else gets a piece of this? And what you're doing by not allowing independent contractors to be treated as employees is hurting those workers. So what if they treat them as employees and it costs $500 million more a year? You don't think other ride service companies would come along? Of course they would. Maybe Uber wouldn't be worth what it is. Its price would fall. It'd be a little harder to raise capital, and you wouldn't have as many billionaires off it. But you would have other competitor models come up. So this is the challenge. And I have nothing against, some progressives are against billionaires. I'm not. Steve Jobs wanted to make $1 billion. Good for him. But the problem is that where is everyone else? Where are they in their aspirations?
Thank you for that. And this will have to be the last question. One just came in. People can't get enough about the scoring, CBO, JCT. So there's one last question on if you think the perceptions of credibility of CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Joint Committee on Taxation are becoming polarized on the Hill, and what does that mean for what those organizations can and should do?
I do think there's some polarization. I mean, on the right, there's a view that they don't like the economic analysis showing deficits, and on the left, there's a concern about deficits shouldn't be the be all and end all. And of course, you in a democracy, you don't want unelected experts to be dictating policy without robust public debate and discussion. And you don't want to just default to CBO analysts saying whether you can or cannot do something. But I think that the important thing is to make CBO as rich in giving as much information as possible to inform the public debate. And right now, in my view, it is, while very works very hard, and I don't question the integrity of people there. I think they don't really have political biases, but it's so skewed towards figuring out things geared towards a deficit and the spending implications, and not enough on the equity. And we have to add that dimension so that they can paint a fuller picture. And then it's for the legislators, not CBO, to decide about whether we want increased inequality or not. That can be a political decision, but we should at least have the information.
Great. Well, with that, Congressman, thank you very much for your time and insights.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you sharing with us today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
And with that, that concludes Equitable Growth 2021, this year's installment of our biennial grantee conference. So thank you to everyone who presented research or provided feedback, and to all of those who attended. We hope you found the conference useful and that you continue to stay engaged with us. Watch for emails from Equitable Growth with a roundup of the week's events and links to session recordings. And please check the Equitable Growth Working Paper Series for work presented at the conference and other cutting-edge research on inequality and growth. If you have any questions at all about what you've heard this week, about our grant program, or you're interested in taking advantage of the many resources we provide, including engaging with policymakers like Congressman Khanna, elevating your work in the media, or connecting with someone you met this week, please feel free to email us at grants@equitablegrowth.org. And finally, our 2021 request for proposals is now live, so please consider applying and be sure to share it with your colleagues and graduate students. Well, thank you again for joining, and hope you have a great rest of the week. Thank you for joining us at the conference this week.